October last year, the writer Louise Perry wrote an article called We Are Repaganising in First Things, an American-based magazine dedicated to religion and culture. Here, Perry connects the grisly and violent realities of ancient Rome to our present, with examples being abortion and euthanasia. There is also a thought-provoking analogy of Christianity being like a clearing in a forest, and once it is over, the dark wolves and winds of paganism take hold. Christians, as she argues, pushed paganism back into the wild through its application of laws against infanticide and later against abortion. Yet this process did not make paganism vanish altogether. Perry cites 17th century England's reluctance to hang mothers guilty of infanticide. She quotes her fellow journalist, the lawyer Helen Dale, as saying juries are pagan due to the lack of convictions for both infanticide and abortion. Her writing is powerful and urgent. Louise Perry is certainly a journalist to watch, particularly on matters concerning women and relationships. Her thesis in First Things is also familiar to Tom Holland's in Dominion. Holland positions secular liberalism and atheism as stemming from Christianity, particularly Western Christianity, and gave dignity to the individual and the marginalized to an extent unfamiliar to the pagan. His book is ultimately targeted towards secular liberals who think the world of Christianity has nothing to do with them. In an interview with John Anderson AO, Holland identifies National Socialism as attacking the moral foundations of Christianity. It's no wonder that in Dominion, Holland goes to great lengths to portray the Persians, the Greeks, and the Romans as particularly barbaric in contrast to the softer, loving Christians. Louise Perry's worldview, therefore, is ultimately informed by a very British, very contemporary approach to Christianity and paganism. You also see this in Helen Dale, Tom Holland, and now Louise Perry. The legal historian Stephen Smith joins them too. We are repaganizing, according to Louise Perry. The pagan forest, once conquered and shaped by Christians, is reclaiming its ground. I disagree. We are not repaganizing, and while the West is seemingly lost touch with Christianity, this should not be interpreted as repaganizing. Rather, our current realities and the broader Western sphere is not shaped by either Christianity or paganism, but something rather new, modern, and connected to contemporary trends in liberalism and secularism. This video essay is my response to Louise Perry, and by extension, writers like Tom Holland and Helen Dale. I simply do not see European history or the history of religion in pagan or Christian terms. For myself, Christianity is not the exact opposite to paganism, and there is a danger in assuming anything not Christian in Europe is pagan. I will draw on ancient, medieval, and modern examples to make my case. However, in my final point, I'll articulate Louise Perry's strongest arguments about the current West. Ultimately, I want to challenge the misconceptions many have about paganism, the West, and Christianity. Let's begin. I'm Madeleine Rose Jones, and I study history, literature, and culture. Welcome to Snowy Fictions. The problem with paganism. The word pagan is a controversial one. Originally used in the Roman Empire by early Christians in the 4th century AD, being a pagan came with automatic anti-Christian associations. This is the core problem with the word pagan. It is Christians, and not the ancient so-called pagans themselves, who use it. In Christian history, and in our contemporary era, The idea of paganism has been used, abused, and distorted. As Owen Davies argued in 2011, it is crucial to stress right from the start that until the 20th century, people did not call themselves pagans to describe the religion they practiced. The notion of paganism, as it is generally understood today, was created by the early Christian church. It is a label that Christians applied to others, one of the antitheses that were central to the process of Christian self-definition. As such, throughout history, it was generally used in a derogatory sense. Certain associations of paganisms to rustic and rural life and connection to nature have certainly shaped modern understandings of what paganism is. Yet paganism plays a huge role, despite its murky definitions, in Christian historiographies. Centuries after Vladimir of Kiev's conversion to Christianity, the Russian writers behind the primary chronicle framed Vladimir as bringing Christianity to the Rus, akin to lighting a dark room. The pagans of Germany and Scandinavia, after all, eventually became Christian. From this, we can understand paganism is also used to mean a type of proto-Christianity, or the state eventual Christians were before Christianization. Honestly, the fact medieval Christian writers use the term pagan so freely says more about Christianity's conceptions about itself than ancient religion. There are other problems with the term pagan too. In the case of ancient history, pagan can mean lumping diverse religions and practices together under this pagan umbrella. Simply, following Norse religion as a Viking is different to an Athenian listening to an oracle in the 4th century BC. When looking at so-called paganism, we can notice many different and at times conflicting traditions. The Druids, after all, came into great conflict with the Romans. We shouldn't also assume so-called pagan religions in antiquity were unified as if in concert with one another. Identification is a huge part of religion and culture. We do not see intense pagan identification. Also, our understanding about pagan cultures is quite limited, such is the case for ancient history. We simply do not know everything about the various beliefs, behaviours and belonging strategies used by Europeans, whether the Celts, the Slavs and the Germanics. The historian Ronald Hutton has made this point quite often in his scholarship. In Blood and Mistletoe, as well as Queens of the Wild and Pagan Britain, Hutton makes a convincing case that whilst Christian societies have a strong and intense perception of pre-Christian religion in Britain and Ireland, this rarely translates into tangible insight into ancient religion. Many critical sources that would assist a historian in understanding ancient religion have either been lost, destroyed, or never existed in the first place. That's why I'll always question these fierce binaries between paganism and Christianity. We simply do not have a sufficient understanding of ancient paganism to portray it how Christians and even neo-pagans portray it. In Louise Perry's essay, her understanding of paganism is limited to the Greco-Roman world, whose heartlands in Italy and Greece should not be assumed as the same in Britain, Russia, France, or Scandinavia. Ancient religion had internal diversity and difference across the Mediterranean and Eurasia. Even in the Abrahamic faiths, like Judaism and Christianity, there are debates and intense arguments. Louise Perry falls into the trap many Christians have sadly done and assume anything that is not explicitly Christian is pagan. The West is absolutely losing her Christianity, but that doesn't mean we are becoming more pagan, especially considering we can never make up our minds on what being pagan even means. Ultimately, I present the thesis that our current societal trends and behaviours suggest something new. I want us to move away from the binary thinking behind pagan and Christian and understand European history and religion in more nuanced terms. I caution against having overtly rigid ideas of what being pagan or Christian means. These may assist in your personal spirituality, but they have massive limitations when studying the history of religion in Europe. To clarify, I have no interest in attacking Christian writers in the Middle Ages for their activities, or to say they were bigoted and misunderstood paganism. Also, there is nothing wrong with Christians having a specific idea of what being a Christian means. This typically helps the Christian in understanding themselves, God, the Gospels, and ideal moral behaviour. But I ask that when undertaking the study of history and religion, we understand Christians as how they have existed throughout time, and the same applies to paganism too. Paganism and Christianity are not opposites to one another. Binary thinking is problematic. The historical categories we use, East versus West, secular versus religious, urban versus rural, modern versus tradition, can suffer from oversimplification and not make sufficient room for the real grey areas in these binaries and the shifting definitions and environments. In the previous section, I mentioned the Primary Chronicle and Russia. Russia is an interesting example because her history shows a controversy between the East and the West. The perception of Russia being an Asian country as opposed to a Western one is certainly shared by some, whereas others argue the opposite. To make the debate even more complicated, it's not uncommon to argue Russia is her own thing, a Eurasian entity. The Russian Federation ultimately challenges the binary between East and West. We have Siberia alongside St. Petersburg. Likewise, Istanbul or Constantinople in Turkey suffers from binary thinking as well. Often pitched as an East meets West city, Istanbul has architecture and culture stemming from all over Eurasia. Interestingly, both Constantinople and Moscow were viewed as new Romes by various Orthodox Christians over time. They are ultimately important to the historian's conception of Christianity and Christendom. Yet, it seems Louise Perry's understanding between paganism and Christianity and that of Tom Holland and Helen Dale is almost to view both as polar opposites with little to no overlap. In the beginning chapters of Dominion, Tom Holland goes to significant lengths to portray pre-Christian societies as brutal and nasty, which, no argument from me, as it is true. Over the course of his book, Christianity is portrayed as this light and West-defining force. To clarify, we have significant evidence to suggest the early Christians were viewed as odd and different from other Romans. Tacitus says the Christians hating mankind and were abominations. The persecution suffered by Christians under various Roman emperors such as Nero, Trajan and Diocletian should not be ignored either. Thus, the perception of Christianity being outsiders to not only the empire but Roman religion is cemented in our psyches. But something happened in the 4th century AD. Constantine the Great converted to Christianity, the first Roman emperor to do so. This is certainly interesting because it showed there could be a link between Rome, her might, empire and ideals, with Christianity. The historians of the time reflected this too. Eusebius of Caesarea produced a very favourable biography on Constantine the Great and pretty much portrayed the Christianization of Rome as inevitable. So-called pagan religion continued to exist after Constantine, and some emperors were certainly not Christian. But late antiquity shows a more complicated picture than pagans versus Christians. We see Christianity change from a small movement out of Jerusalem and into Christian Europe. This meant Christians had to reconcile with their so-called pagan heritage. In Greece, we have numerous examples of classical statues bearing crosses and other Christian symbolism. This may suggest Christians being a mad raving mob like ISIS and seeking the destruction of the classical world. But let's not get ridiculous. The reason why Christians did this was to claim the pre-Christian world as their own as part of their historiography and understanding of the world. Christian theology has a concept called the virtuous pagan, which argues it is false to condemn to death the Aristotles of the world. The point being, there is overlap between paganism and Christianity, and this is shown in the many ways through ancient history, late antiquity, and the early Middle Ages. The shift from Greco-Roman religion to Christianity, or, in the case of Northern Europe, Germanic and Norse religion, to Christianity, occurred over centuries. What Louise Perry sees as signs of pagan heritage remaining is really Christians adopting and refashioning over time. Every religion evolves. I am bothered by the very static portrayals of paganism and Christianity given by Louise Perry, Tom Holland, and Helen Dale. It just doesn't capture the dynamic nature of religion. Before moving on to the next point, I have a warning. Too often in binary thinking, the individual is at great risk of demonizing one while idolizing the other. My experience with some neo-pagans have demonstrated the real danger of this. They have a very idealistic, rosy, and hopeful vision for paganism, but give a demonic and uncharitable portrayal to Christianity. You also have numerous ancient historians who are so smitten with a pre-Christian Mediterranean, like Edward Gibbons and Catherine Nixie, that a harsh and false depiction is given to Christianity. Binary thinking does often result in classifying everything as either good or bad. If you are a Christian or someone very sympathetic to Christianity, it is not ideal to portray pre-Christian religion as inherently evil with no redeeming qualities. Because it wasn't. Think of the philosophy and literature from ancient Greece and the scientific knowledge, culture, and writings born in Mesopotamia, Persia, and Rome. Think of Homer's The Odyssey or the Epic of Gilgamesh. The good news is, there is an intense strain of Christianity which acknowledges these achievements and weaves them into Christian history. The best example is the 12th century Renaissance, where medieval universities emerged and the love of ancient learning was unlocked, with a special note given to Aristotle by St. Thomas Aquinas, or the fact Icelandic epics were preserved and were written down by Christians. In my video about medieval chivalry and Game of Thrones, I make the connection between knighthood and ancient Roman ideals, and who honestly can forget Anna Comnene, whose love for Homer shines through her The Alexiad, or Boethius, whose philosophy fused ideas of Fortuna into his work. We also have Greco-Roman religion shaping Christian art history, especially in the Catholic Church, with St. Peter's Basilica taking cues from Athens and Rome. We can, of course, acknowledge all of this, while pointing out the tendency of some Christians to dismiss certain ideas, symbols, and things as pagan. The history of religion, especially in Europe, transcends the binaries between pagan and Christian. Whilst meaning separate things, it is false and misleading to portray both as polar opposites, with utterly separate morality and approaches to life and death. There's a history of syncretism, influence, and reception. That's why, ultimately, I dislike the idea we are repaganizing. Losing our Christianity, whilst absolutely, in my view, a tragic event, does not mean becoming more ancient and, well, more pagan. When we take a wide scope of religious history in the West, we observe another challenge to the binary between paganism and Christianity. Simply, the West has encountered ideas and religions beyond both from antiquity to the present day. These can include Hermeticism, Gnosticism, approaches to Christianity labeled as heresy, Judaism, Islam, and atheism. When we broaden the West to include the ancient Near East, we see an even wider diversity of religions, including Zoroastrianism, Mithraism, various mystery cults, and numerous Greco-Egyptian systems of belief. Many of these traditions are frequently lumped into the wide umbrellas of pagan or Abrahamic religions, with the assumption given to the latter of being a foreign intrusion. We shouldn't also forget the different schools of thought in philosophy like Stoicism, Romanticism, Scholasticism, Idealism, Rationalism, and Nihilism. Theology overlaps with philosophy, and naturally, the history of the West is shaped by many diverging ideas and concepts. Europeans have always had different visions to one another about ideal politics and society. St. Augustine's City of God differs from Aristotle's conceptions of order and reason. Also, Christian history is internally diverse, and there is simply many variations and debate as to what being a Christian means. While it's tempting to see the divergences as only existing from the Reformation or even the Great Schism of AD 1054, the truth is, these differences have always existed within Christendom. Ultimately, I struggled to connect with Helen Dale, Tom Holland, and Louise Perry's portrayal of Christianity because it seemed based from Anglo-Protestant Christianity. Being raised Catholic and keenly aware of the various Oriental Orthodox churches, Christological debates, and Byzantine traditions, this rigid depiction of Christianity as being fundamentally liberal as well as soft didn't really resonate with me. I see the history of Christianity as being stacked with debate, divergence, and diversity. Whether to celebrate this is complicated, but we must resist simplifying the history of religion in Europe to mere paganism and Christianity. As stated earlier, the categories of pagan and Christian have internal diversity and divergence, and we can see various intellectual traditions and approaches shaping Europe. I also caution against clinging tightly onto notions about Western values, or in the West we are liberal and value freedom. It's not uncommon for those who promote a pagan and Christian binary of European history to hyper-focus on the West's liberalism. The most explicit example I can give is Tom Holland's Dominion, who interprets liberalism, even secular liberalism, as the fruit of Christianity. There's also the idea of Western values, broadly speaking, as coming from Athens and Jerusalem. Yet, as I argue in the next point, liberalism is neither Christian nor pagan, and the West's approach towards liberalism, secularism, and freedom is not necessarily permanent or shared by all Westerners. You, after all, cannot have Athens without Sparta, is what I am trying to say. Western intellectual and religious history has far more texture than Louise Perry portrays in her article. Abortion and euthanasia are not pagan. Discussing abortion and euthanasia, as well as any political topic, will always be difficult online. I'm not interested in sharing my opinions here, as that will distract from the point I need to make. Regardless, Louise Perry makes a connection between abortion and infanticide as practiced by the Romans. Euthanasia is also reminiscent to the Roman approach towards suicide and death. The title of her article, We Are Repaganising, alludes to the West becoming like the Greco-Roman pagans while we embrace abortion and euthanasia. I've previously made the case that Louise Perry, as well as Helen Dale and Tom Holland, make numerous inaccuracies about pre-Christian religion, but I also believe Louise Perry is wrong about abortion and euthanasia being pagan. These trends in the West have more in common with liberalism's tendency towards individual agency and human choice than anything to do with pagan conceptions about honor and strength. I do not view liberalism as either Christian or pagan. It is its own thing, and if anything, challenges both. Liberalism also gave rise to secularism, which dethroned Christianity in the West, and quite explicitly so in France. While some liberal ideas about dignity and reason have roots in Christianity, not all the liberal project is Christian. That's why we are not repaganizing, but we are emerging into a new era, one that is not Christian or pagan. Again, I am not here to give a political lecture, but liberalism and modern Western societies rationalize abortion and euthanasia as being about choice. An abortion activist will say the pregnant mother has a right to choose whether her baby lives or dies. Likewise, euthanasia is portrayed as voluntary. Honestly, I find these very modern ideas about human choice and agency over one's life not really rooted in antiquity. When a Roman tells someone, "You might as well just kill yourself," they aren't giving medical advice or making a statement about the freedom to choose. They are expressing their disgust towards weakness. The Spartans are quite well known for their infanticide, where babies were inspected for deformities and good health. But the Spartan process of deciding which baby to throw and which to keep was done without the choice of the mother. Modernity does have a brutal streak, which Perry is apt to recognize. But ancient brutality and violence did not care about personal choice and individual agency. These are very liberal and modern ideas. And in fact, most advocates for abortion and euthanasia do lean progressive, and I highly doubt they see themselves as Romans or Spartans deploring any sign of weakness. A progressive, pro-choice activist is sincere in thinking women should have a say on whether a pregnancy continues. I don't find this attitude pagan at all. I find traditional European religions very hierarchical, power-inclined, and confronting. A contemporary liberal, in my opinion, wants to shield society and themselves away from this. This difference is ultimately why I do not see abortion and euthanasia as pagan. Louise Perry's strongest point. Before concluding, I'd like to highlight the strengths of Louise Perry's thesis. She is correct. Something is happening in the West, and the process of de-Christianization has resulted in bloody consequences, which she aptly warns about. Canada's medical assistance in dying program and abortion are not Christian at all. She hints at a darker type of human behavior and understands the role Christianity has played in taming such destructive instincts. I firmly believe the impact of Christianity has been positive for the West in terms of civilization and culture. We forgo Christianity at our own peril. But what Louise Perry deems pagan, I believe, is just an untamed human nature and history. I am also concerned about the more feral, wild, and disordered aspects of humanity being set to unleash in the West. This is so true in 2024, where existential dread about declining living standards, crime, war, and leaders who refuse to listen continues to march on. In addition, the modern West's occasional ignorance about the rest of the world and man's proclivity towards violence is partially explained through material conditions and technology. Simply, many Westerners as of late were wealthy enough to avoid the brutal trends of human history like poverty, violence, and corruption. We could afford a police force, private security even, and had the freedom to live wherever we pleased. We had more than food. We could choose what food we had and the type of phones and televisions. This is part of living in functioning, safe, and well-run societies with high trust and good levels of social cohesion. Granted, not every Westerner had this, and today many remain impoverished. But from the post-World War II period to the global financial crisis, the Western life overall was a good one, and this wealth and freedom allowed us to become naive towards the feral, wild, and untamed aspects of human nature. I am not surprised at all that one of the main foreign policy thinkers today, Francis Fukuyama, wrote in the 1990s about liberalism always remaining in the future, always lurking as an option. He couldn't imagine a world without liberalism and the ideas of freedom and prosperity. He's since developed his thoughts into a more nuanced position and does not take his liberal principles for granted. And that is ultimately my argument. We must not assume the Western notions of equality, justice, and dignity are here to stay forever. I recall a terrific quote from the late Samuel P. Huntington, best known for his blockbuster The Clash of Civilizations and the Remaking of the World Order. He warns, in the emerging world of ethnic conflict and civilizational clash, Western belief in the universality of Western culture suffers three problems. It is false, it is immoral, and it is dangerous. My point isn't to say humans are all bad and rotten. Of course not. And I do not believe that at all. It's just that we shouldn't underestimate the level of brutality and violence which was once accepted in the West. The modern instincts towards enlightenment, human rights, and universal brotherhood took centuries to fully emerge. Ultimately, I caution against presuming they'll always be there too. Like Perry, I am under no delusion that history always lends itself to progress and happiness. That's why I congratulate Louise Perry for her willingness to investigate the darker shades of humanity. All discussions about European religion, whether pagan, Christian, or something else, need that. Conclusion. This video came out of a desire to see European history and religion outside of the binary categories of Christian and pagan. Whilst critical in terms of culture and self-identification, I am concerned of the narrow presumptions and stereotypes they carry. A pagan isn't anyone who rejects Christianity, and a Christian isn't necessarily the ancient equivalent of a hippie. Religions are internally diverse, they evolve, and by understanding European history of religion as brimming with intellectual debate, syncretism, geopolitics, and broad theological concerns, we develop a better and more nuanced picture of not only the past, but our contemporary realities as well. The West is not repaganizing. To do so earnestly and accurately is impossible, but the West has certainly succumbed to something new and, dare I say, hostile and hideous. Louise Perry mentions euthanasia, with a specific reference to medical assistance in dying from Canada. The motives behind this did not stem from Christianity or a pagan view of the human body, but distorted bioethics prioritizing individual choice to its logical conclusion. MAID, like abortion and drug decriminalization, have more in common with contemporary dogmas of liberalism than paganism. I didn't go in depth about neo-paganism or those who identify today with paganism. To be blunt, I have intense and often controversial thoughts about neo-paganism, but it's not fair to blame them for our current societal ills, or to assume they are the exact opposite to Christians, even though many try to portray themselves like that. Our rigid ideas of what being pagan or Christian means certainly need flexibility to adjust to the coming era. But back to you. What are your thoughts on Louise Perry's thesis? Are we repaganizing? Comment below. I'd love to read your opinions and start a discussion. Subscribe for frequent videos on history, literature, and culture. I also have a mailing list, creative writing courses, and a blog linked below. My goal with this channel is to share video essays and educational content on the humanities, a discipline long chained by paywalls, elitism, and groupthink. I hope for you to join me in this journey. Thanks for watching. I will see you soon, and goodbye for now.